It was almost real. The Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 119. Hello and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling from the 1860s to 1930. And in this episode, we will be discussing Harry Hill, a New York sporting man and collar and elbow professional wrestler who played a large role in professional wrestling and bare knuckle prize fighting in the 1860s and the 1870s. So before I get into the update this week, I had recorded a podcast to go out on Monday, January 26th, because I wanted to capture my thoughts on the first UFC on Paramount on January 24th, Saturday, January 24th. And I recorded all of that audio on Sunday morning, January 25th, and that audio was unusable. Now, in hindsight, if I hadn't lost my temper and deleted it, my son probably could have fixed it, but I'm not so sure that the audio experience would have been that great even after he had fixed it, so maybe it was all for the best. The reason you're hearing this episode on Thursday, January 29th, is because I'm publishing this in the evening after I got off work. I finally had some time that I could record the podcast again because they're predicting some more snow. So I'm going to sit in and record a podcast instead of going out and driving in the snow today. So my apologies to everybody that was expecting an episode on Monday. It was an audio-visual fault. Probably my fault that the audio was so bad. So I take full responsibility that we didn't get an episode to you on Monday. On the update this week, I learned something new about Vince McMahon taking over wrestling at the Chase in late 1983 and early 1984. As I've said before, we had Black Sunday before the Georgia promotion experienced Black Saturday in early 1984. I always thought it was late 1983, but now I'm discovering that I was a little off on my time frame, and we'll talk about that in the review. Also received news this week that Big Bad Bobby Duncum Sr. died on January 21st, 2026, which just happened to be my birthday. Bobby Duncum Sr. was 81 years of age. And something that I thought was kind of odd, it's one of those coincidences of history. There's no causal effect, it's just something that's a coincidence. But Bobby Duncum Jr., Bobby Duncum Sr.'s son, died on January 24th, 2000 at 34 years of age. So just 3 days shy of exactly 26 years since he lost his son, Bobby Duncum Sr. passed away. And I was very familiar with Big Bad Bobby Duncum because he was used in St. Louis a lot. He had some St. Louis ties in that he was drafted by the Cardinals in the 1967 draft. He played 4 games for the Cardinals in 1968. But besides being a football player for West Texas State, he was also friends with the Funks and a lot of the other football players who became professional wrestlers in that West Texas territory. So they actually broke Bobby Duncum into the business in 1966 in Amarillo. And then for like the next 3 years, he would wrestle professionally in the off season, and then he would play football in the fall. There's not a ton of Bobby Duncum Sr. matches out there. There's lots of clips. There's very few full matches. But I found a pretty good full match for Bobby Duncum, and it's him versus Dick Slater from Houston in 1981. So I will put I will put a link for that match into the show notes at kenzermanjr.com/episode 119. And you can check that match out. And then my final part for the update this week is that I'm dividing the book on the 19th century pioneer wrestlers basically by focusing the first half of the book on the top collar and elbow wrestlers. So we're talking about Homer Lane, J.H. McLaughlin, Henry Moses Dufer, and John McMahon. And then the second half of the book will be focused on Greco-Roman wrestlers not named William Muldoon, and that'll make up the second half of the book. Even though my interest is really catch wrestling and catch as catch can wrestling, in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, catch as catch can would be wrestled occasionally, but there were not as many specialists in it as there would emerge in the 1880s with Edwin Bibby, who could wrestle both Greco-Roman and catch, Joe Acton, who was a better catch wrestler than he was a Greco-Roman wrestler, and then a kind of a catch specialist like an Evan Strangler Lewis. So this book is going to be focused on the collar and elbow and the Greco-Roman wrestlers. I might do a future book project on the catch wrestlers who were not Evan Strangler Lewis, Farmer Burns, who deserve a book of their own, but some of the other wrestlers that we haven't covered in some of the other books. That's just a maybe. I need to know that there's a justification for that project before I move forward. I need to know there's enough catch wrestlers that have the same situation as the collar and elbow wrestlers and the Greco-Roman wrestlers in this book, and that their careers, because they were either wrestling part-time, there weren't as many matches back then, much harder to get around with the travel, so their wrestling exploits really don't make up what would constitute a book. But if you put 4 or 5 of their careers together, you could make a decent book about professional wrestling. So the subject of our main historical content this week is a gentleman by the name of Harry Hill. And Harry Hill was an English kid born in Epsom, England in 1827. And he spent most of his first 20 years of his life hanging out with his uncle, who was a professional gambler. And since his uncle was always at the racetrack, Harry Hill was also always at the racetrack. But he developed such an expertise on horse racing that George Woolsey, who was an American businessman who lived in the Astoria, Queens neighborhood in New York City, decided to hire Harry Hill to manage his stable in New York City. And he brings Harry Hill to the United States in the 1850s. Besides being an expert on horse racing, and of course, he's got quite a bit of knowledge about gambling, having been around his uncle for the first 20 years of his life, Harry Hill is also a skilled collar and elbow wrestler. He has a couple of contests. He probably worked some too, but the only ones I know about that him wrestling were 2 contests. The first one was a contest with Lieutenant Ainsworth, who, if he wasn't a nationally known collar and elbow wrestler, he was at least famous in the Northeast, and Hill defeated him. And then Hill defeated Homer Lane in New York City around 1865, 1866, right after the Civil War. But Hill was so impressed with Lane that he takes Lane under his wing. And by the time Lane becomes Hill's protege, Hill owns a sporting house, or what we would call a tavern, sports bar, in New York City. And this bar attracts bare-knuckle prize fighters and their managers and the people that hang around bare-knuckle prize fighting. It attracts professional wrestlers. It attracts the gamblers who hang around both of those sports and bet. And it also attracts organized criminals who like to hang around with the wrestlers and the boxers. Because of the crowd that it attracts, of course, the reformers in New York City are appalled that these sordid classes that we'll put in parentheses are hanging out at Harry Hill's place and doing Lord knows what. That his bar, tavern, sports bar, sporting house is what we're going to call it for the podcast, is frequently a target of the city authorities and the reformers, but not necessarily the police, at least not in the beginning. Harry Hill, besides being involved with professional wrestling, is also involved with bare-knuckle prize fighting. Bare knuckle prize fighting is illegal almost everywhere in the United States in the 19th century. Hill, initially, when he gets involved with bare knuckle prize fighting, he's like every other organizer of the sport. He has to try to find some obscure locations where that they can hold these fights so they don't attract the attention of the authorities. Even if they do attract the attention of the authorities, they don't want to put themselves in a place where they can be arrested. So they look for obscure places where there's some questions about jurisdiction, who really has. In St. Louis, there are a number of islands. I think there's less now than there used to be, but there were always a number of islands in the middle of the Mississippi River. And they were sort of a no man's land. Illinois didn't know if they had jurisdiction. Missouri didn't know if they had jurisdiction. So a lot of the bare knuckle prize fights around St. Louis would occur on these islands because with the questionable authority, neither police from Illinois nor Missouri really wanted to go and arrest somebody and take the time to have to get a boat or a ferry, go over, arrest the people, get them back across the river to their towns to put them in jail, only to have the judge release them because they didn't have jurisdiction where the arrest took place. Harry Hill's trying to do the same thing in New York, looks for obscure places or counties where there's question of who owns the area. But by the 1870s, he's hosting bare knuckle prize fights in his sporting house, which I'm sure you're asking yourself, how can he do that when it's illegal? Well, we'll get to that a little bit more as we get to the end of the episode. But just to continue his involvement with bare knuckle prize fighting, his main involvement with bare knuckle prize fighting, other than I'm sure gambling on the outcome and backing some of the guys that he was associated with, like Billy Edwards, who was an English fighter, I think of the lightweight division. Hill was a supporter of Billy Edwards. Hill's involvement with bare knuckle prize fighting is a lot of times as a stakeholder. And the reason he is the stakeholder is because he is considered scrupulously honest by all of the people that are hanging around the sport. Almost said business. My mind keeps going to pro wrestling, and it wouldn't have been called a business at this time either. But when you hear people talk all the time now, it's, the business. Oh, it's not good for the business. Bare knuckle prize fighting was a business, but it was a sport, and he was the stakeholder. Because when you had a fight like a Jem Mace versus a Joe Coburn, you could have $2,000-$3,000 purse riding on that match. Harry Hill would be the guy that the organizers asked to hold the purse, because the fighters would tell you if there was $3,025.10 in the purse when Harry Hill handed you that bag, it would have $3,025.10 in it. Scrupulously honest, never helped himself to the purse. He was a attendee at almost all of the major prize fights in the 1860s, 1870s, and early 1880s because of that. In the 1860s, he starts helping organize collar and elbow wrestling bouts. A lot of them occur in his sporting house. If they're going to attract a big crowd, they'll go to an opera house or something of that nature in New York City. But a lot of his matches that he's involved with, and a lot of time Harry Hill served as the referee, a lot of those matches are worked. Homer Lane works matches with other New York wrestlers. He works matches with J.H. McLaughlin. He works matches with John McMahon. Homer Lane has no problem working matches with the other wrestlers. And the reason being is because they are working, and part of the main reason they're working is they are trying to bilk the gamblers that are betting on these matches, because they'll make more money from the gambling than they will if they wrestled for a purse. So if Homer Lane is going to wrestle J.H. McLaughlin, say both sides put up $500. In reality, that $500 is really a fiction, because neither one is going to collect. even though there'll be somebody who wins that match, they're each just going to take the $500 back because they're working, cooperating in this match, and they're going to split the gambling revenue. So you would have people out working the crowd, trying to get people to bet not on just the outcome, but who would get the quickest fall, who would get the first fall. They would bet on all kinds of things. You know, what if they won the fall uh, by grapevine? You could bet on, it's just to your imagination what they could bet on. But normally the three most common things that they would bet on is first fall, quickest fall, and then the outcome. If the odds were heavily favoring Homer Lane to take the first fall, and they could make more money if J.H. McLaughlin took the first fall, guess who would take the first fall? J.H. McLaughlin. If the odds were such that everybody is betting that J.H. McLaughlin, because he's as big as a house, he was like 6'1", 235 to 250 pounds, sometimes as heavy as 265, and like a Homer Lane is 5'8" and 170. If they bet, J.H. McLaughlin is going to take the first fall, guess who scores a very quick, fluky, fast fall to win the lion's share of that gambling money? Homer Lane. So they're working a lot of times to further their gambling winnings. They claimed titles, but those titles were mostly fictions. They didn't really exist for the most part. The motivation was to enhance their gambling winnings. Now, jump forward into the 19 teens. The main motivation for working is now the development of the promotional system, promoters wanting to control titles because they believe that would result in more money. This circuit that Harry Hill and Homer Lane have in effect really operates from about 1867 to about 1873, 1874. Homer Lane's getting a little older. He's wrestling a little bit less. But he would continue on as kind of a part-time wrestler, but involved with Harry Hill's other business enterprises throughout the 1870s. Harry Hill's establishment, despite its reputation, Harry Hill has some very strict rules. He does not allow profane language. He does not allow fighting on his premises. And despite what a lot of the city authorities believed, he did not allow prostitution in his premises. He did have private rooms for his guests. If a man and a woman got together at his tavern and wanted to go spend time in a private room, he had those, but he would not allow prostitutes to use those rooms. These rules led him to get into several fisticuffs with organized crime figures who didn't like his rules and definitely didn't like Harry Hill telling him to knock it off or get out of his place. And he had a couple near-death experiences in the 1870s, but he always seemed to come out on top, or at least unscathed enough that he could recover. What he could not recover from, and what initially allowed him to host bare-knuckle prize fights in his sporting house, eventually became too much, and that is like most New York City businessmen at the time. Harry Hill made payoffs to the New York City police officers working his area. This is very common in the 1800s in New York City from like the 1850s. If you want to read a good book about the corruption in the New York City Police Department, there is a book about Theodore Roosevelt's 2 years as New York City Police Commissioner from 1892 to 1894. I didn't look it up before the podcast, but I'm pretty sure the name of the book is Commissioner Roosevelt. If you read that book, you will see how corrupt the New York City Police Department was at the time. If I can find a link for it, I will put it in the show notes at kenzermanjr.com, episode 119. We'll also have the links for the match for Bobby Duncum and the two cards that I'm getting ready to talk about in the review that I don't remember seeing them, but I had to have seen them because of when they were. But we'll talk about that in the review. Harry Hill made the payoffs to the New York City Police Department until they started demanding exorbitant sums in the 1880s. And when, I believe it was command officers of the district he was in, but it's hard to tell because most people wanted a piece of the graft at that time in the police department. They started demanding sums that Harry Hill thought were exorbitant. Now, realize Harry Hill, even though he never claimed more than $250,000, and remember, this is $250,000 in the 1870s, which is in the tens of $1,000,000 today. There were rumors that there were some years between professional wrestling, the gambling, professional boxing, or not professional boxing at the time, let's be clear in our terminology, bare knuckle prize fighting, professional boxing, the glove contests we think of today, really start coming into vogue around the late 1880s and 1890s. And what finally turned the tide and got professional boxing allowed, even though bare knuckle prize fighting was never allowed, was that a lot of gentlemen and sporting clubs took up amateur boxing, the 3-round variety, and it put a lot of pressure on the state legislatures to allow boxing because gentlemen were doing it now. Harry Hill, when he refused to make the payments to New York City PD, they started cracking down and coming in and walking through his sporting house, trying to arrest people for any pretext that they could come up with. Harry Hill, though, was not one to take that lying down, so he went to the newspapers and exposed the corruption of the New York City Police Department, which brought down the full force of the New York City authorities onto Harry Hill, because even though they knew the police department was corrupt, and some of them weren't crazy about it either, they couldn't have Harry Hill exposing to all the New York City citizens, which I'm sure they knew too. When he exposed the corruption in the New York City Police Department in the newspapers, between the police department and the city authorities, they basically ran him out of business. And he actually moved out of New York City. So for the longest time, his sporting house was at 26 East Houston Street in the Bowery neighborhood of New York City. And it operated from the early 1860s until the middle of the 1880s. But he had to move, and he bought another hotel kind of sporting, well, it wasn't a sporting house, a hotel bar in, it wasn't Buffalo, but it was one of the cities outside of New York City. That was never as financially successful as the sporting house on Houston Street was. And he was a generous person, and when he was making a lot of money, he would sign promissory notes for his friends and people he probably should have exercised better judgment and not sign those promissory notes. And so by the 1890s, when he passes away in his, I think he was late 60s, early 70s, he is almost destitute. He's had to sell the hotel and bar, and he's basically living with family or friends because he doesn't have any money left. It's a tragic end. So for the review, I had always thought, now let's set this up. When Vince McMahon took over the Wrestling at the Chase time slot, I was 14 years old, and I was not smart. I was not a smart fan. I was just a kid that enjoyed going to the professional wrestling matches with his big sister and talking about wrestling with her. But we were, even after 1982, when it started to go downhill quick, we continued to watch Wrestling at the Chase. We would watch World Class Championship Wrestling on Channel 30 at 10 o'clock. And then we would watch Wrestling at the Chase at 11 o'clock on Channel 11 KPLR. And I would still talk about it with my big sister. And then my two younger sisters had become fans by this point. So all four of us would talk about it occasionally. I remember distinctly turning on Wrestling at the Chase And I was, in my mind, I thought it was late 1983, but it was actually the first week of January 1984. And being shocked that it was not wrestling at the Chase that I was used to, the St. Louis Wrestling Club promotion from the KPLR studio, but Vince McMahon up there talking about his WWF wrestling and how we were in for such a treat to be seeing this. And I did not like the product at all. To me, it was comic book wrestling. And so when I hear people talk about Black Saturday for the Georgia Wrestling Championship, I always laugh because I'm like, yeah, we had that 6 months earlier. I discovered the only probably really good episode of Central States All Star Wrestling I ever saw. And I discovered it aired in the place of Wrestling at the Chase in December of 1983, December 25th, which is Christmas Day, which I would have watched. I would have snuck off somewhere because I had a TV in my room to go watch it. And I didn't remember this specifically. I know I saw it. I remember seeing Ric Flair versus Mr. Wrestling too. So let's back up just a couple of months and we'll talk about what's happening on this card. And you'll also see very quickly why St. Louis was in the toilet after decades of being a strong, viable wrestling promotion. In September of 1983, KPLR notifies the St. Louis Wrestling Club that they are ending their relationship with them that has gone back to 1959, when I think it was Ted Koppler, I get him mixed up with his son all the time, who started the Channel 11 independent station in St. Louis and who also owned the Chase Park Plaza. Being a prominent businessman in St. Louis, he knew Sam Muchnick well, and they were coming back on a plane in 1959, and Ted Koppler started asking Sam Muchnick about why he didn't have professional wrestling on TV. Sam talked about some of his objections to it, and just the two of them talking and wanting to be in business together, on a napkin on this airplane, they mapped out what would become Wrestling at the Chase, and it ran from 1959 until the end of 1983. This is all invisible to us. As I said, I'm not a smart fan. And if they probably talked about it in the newspaper, but if my dad didn't point it out to me and I hadn't read that particular newspaper, I would not have seen it. And I know for a fact that neither my big sister, who was 15 years older than me, so she was almost 30, knew about it either. So these two episodes of Central States All-Star Wrestling that aired December 18th and December 25th aired because the last episodes of the St. Louis Wrestling Club version of Wrestling at the Chase had already aired, and KPLR wouldn't let them use their studio to film any more episodes as they had severed their relationship. At the bottom of the screen on this episode that was playing, it said the taping for Wrestling at the Chase that was supposed to be today, so I think that was December 18th, has been canceled. The next taping is scheduled for December 27th, and tickets are available at, and it was going to be filmed at the Coruscant Room, which had not been the home of Wrestling at the Chase for probably 5 to 10 years. They were in the KPLR studio when I was watching it. And the Coruscant Room is a very fancy ballroom in the Chase Park Plaza Hotel. That did not register with me at the time, but now, knowing what I know now, if I'd have been a little older, knowing what I know now, that was the WWF taping. The Channel 11 was broadcasting at the bottom of that show. But because that show was from Central States, I thought that something happened and St. Louis Wrestling Club wasn't able to tape when they had planned to, so they ran these two episodes instead. And then the regular St. Louis Wrestling Club television show was going to be on the following week, which that turned out to be the WWF F show, which, as I said, my reaction to that was, what is this crap? The Central States All Star shows that aired on December 18th and December 25th were great, but they were great for a couple of reasons. Number one, most of the talent was not regular Central States talent. Because Vince McMahon was coming into St. Louis and challenging an NWA promotion, promotions from around the country that were involved with the NWA sent talent. This is what happened all the time back when you had the Georgia Wrestling War, when you had other professional wrestling wars. Whenever somebody challenged the NWA promotion, the NWA would send talent in to make the show so much bigger and to try to run off the Outlaw or whoever was coming in to compete. This wasn't going to work with Vince because Vince had all the talent. He would just keep buying up the talent from around the country, and that did more to crush the other promotions than any other thing that he ever did. But because they got all of this talent, they actually had a decent wrestling show. As I said, I was not smart to professional wrestling when all of this was going on. But I can tell you, within 6 months of getting Central States All Star Wrestling, I knew exactly why the St. Louis wrestling promotion went in the toilet in 1982 after Sam had retired. My sister and I had season tickets from mid 1981 to the end of 1982. We hardly went to any cards in 1982 because we weren't interested in them. They were trying to elevate Central States talent that had always been in the mid card or lower, and they weren't bringing in as many of the big stars. Now, they rectified that in 83 when Larry Matisick started his Outlaw promotion. And then in 84, they were trying to combat Vince, who was doing better than I realized he was in St. Louis, by bringing in the Von Erichs. And really, during that time, after Sam retired, the only talent that was really over with the St. Louis Wrestling Club, which was Sam's old promotion, now owned by Bob Geigel, Pat O'Connor. And I always blamed Pat O'Connor at first, but it was really Bob Geigel was the person behind that new company. He was the president, and he was the longtime promoter of Central States. And so let me read this card off to you. And this card occurred on November 10th, 1983, and it was at Memorial Hall in Kansas City, Kansas, which was the normal Thursday night venue for wrestling in the Kansas City promotion. They would occasionally, I mean, like once every 3 years, run Kemper Arena in Kansas City, Missouri, but because that building held between 17 and 19,000 people, they could never fill that up. So most of the time they were in Memorial Hall, which held 3,500 people. And with this card and a lot of talent from outside the promotion, they still only drew 2,789 people. And so let me read you the card. The first match is Bobby Fulton. This is pre-Fantastics. He would be one half of the Fantastics in another few years. Versus Scott Ferris, who was kind of a muscular guy from Portland. His career only lasted from like 1982 to 1986. And then he was out of the business, and he really got in the business because of his look. But you look at him, he already looks like he's in his late 30s. And that was the opening match that went a time limit draw. I think it was a 10 or a 15-minute time limit. The second match, these are two Central States regulars, is Doug Summers defeating Tom Jones. The third match, these are all Central States regulars too. Jerry Brown and Roger Kirby was a Central States homesteader, defeated Booker T and Angelo Mosca Jr. Angelo Mosca Jr. was from Mid-Atlantic, and he had a very short career. He was really only in professional wrestling because of who his dad was. And Booker T was a gentleman who would die just 3 years later, refereeing a match in Tampa, Florida. He'd moved pretty much into officiating, and he had a heart attack refereeing a match and tragically died at only 42 years of age. Tiger Mask is not the Tiger Mask we think of as Misawa. And who was the original Tiger Mask? Sayama. It's neither one of them. It's a guy from the United States in a tiger mask, and he defeats Grizzly Evans. Now we get into where they're starting to get into a little bit of star power. So these last 4 matches, you would have thought would have been able to draw them a house. So you got Paul Orndorff in from Georgia, the former national heavyweight champion, and getting ready to go be one of Vince McMahon's biggest stars in 1984, is key to the national expansion as Hulk Hogan and Roddy Piper. And Paul Orndorff wrestles and defeats Ron Ritchie. Ron Ritchie was I believe, a Canadian wrestler, but who spent a lot of time in the Central States. And he was kind of their only young up and coming talent. And it was a good match. And Orndorff gave Ritchie a little bit of the match and made him look good before he beat him. Here is the Central States mainstay match of the week. Bulldog Bob Brown, who is one of the main reasons that St. Louis went in the toilet in 1982, and Buzz Tyler, another Central States regular. They defeated 666, who was a Central States journeyman by the name of Jesse Hester, who kind of fell into this gimmick later in his career, and he was actually one of the bigger stars and one of the more watchable guys in Central States in 85 and 86. And so hearing that, you know how bad Central States was in 85 and 86. And then the Mongol, who is Gene Lewis, the kayfabe brother of Dale Lewis, towards the tail end of his career. So that these guys are all Central States mainstays. And then you have Ric Flair in from Mid-Atlantic, and he defeats Mr. Wrestling 2. Now remember, this is November 10th, 1983. This is 2 or 3 weeks before Ric Flair would defeat Harley Race at Starrcade 83. He's in 3 matches from the top, and he defeats Mr. Wrestling 2 in 13 minutes. And the reason I'm going over this card is all these matches were on that December 18th show and December 25th show, which the December 25th show is the best. And I will have links for both of those shows in the show notes at kenzermanjr.com/episode 119. And then the co-main event, and this is the match that probably is the one that would have drawn the house. Although I can't take anything away from Harley and Ted DiBiase. Harley was super over, particularly in Central States where he was part owner. And Ted DiBiase is one of the best wrestlers that ever came through St. Louis and Central States. But you have Bruiser Brody wrestling Kamala in a match that ends as a double countout. But Kamala was either in Mid-South or Texas at the time. And he's taking on Bruiser Brody, who's Japan, world class, kind of bouncing around a few other places as well. That was a barn burner. They brawled all over the building, and that was one of the matches, along with Harley versus Ted DiBiase, on the December 25th show. One of the few episodes of Central States Wrestling worth watching, to be honest. And then the main event was Harley Race defeating Ted DiBiase in 17 minutes, which was fast. I was surprised to see that it went that long. But maybe they figured we brought in all this talent and we only drew 2,789 fans. We're not going to stay here too long tonight. Need to get home and do the laundry. And so that was the card. When you look at all of these matches and the people that were wrestling, the TV shows on the 18th and the 25th of December had all of these matches on it. But because of the length of those matches could not take up the full 2 hours for both of those shows, so they had to repeat one match. And what match do you think they repeated? Do you think they put Ric Flair versus Mr. Wrestling on 2 weeks in a row? Or Bruiser Brody versus Kamala? Even Bobby Fulton versus Scott Ferris? Nope. The match you got to see 2 weeks in a row to make sure you didn't miss it was Bulldog Bob Brown and Avalanche Buzz Tyler versus 666 and the Mongol. So now you know why this promotion was at death's door as early as 1983, and it got finished off either 84 or 85. They finally sold the thing to Crockett in 86, and I think that the TV show went all the way up to 86, because I watched that horrible show most every week. You know, as a wrestling fan, sometimes you're kind of self-loathing at the stuff that you'll watch. You keep watching thinking, it's got to get better. It's got to get better. It never gets better. Those are the best episodes that I ever saw of Central State's All-Star Wrestling. So I will put a link in the show notes. And I do recommend you check out the shows. If you skip the Bob Brown match, I don't blame you. But it is the best card probably they were able to muster at that time or ever from then until the time the promotion closed in 1986. I've already gone a little bit longer than I intended. KenzermanJr.com is the place to go to find what I'm currently working on. There's also links to other projects I've done in the past, as well as a host of posts on not only professional wrestling, but combat sports history and St. Louis history. If you've not rated the podcast wherever you listen to it, I would greatly appreciate it if you did that. That helps to keep the podcast visible and help people that have not discovered it find it. And if you want to ask me a question, you can always write me at I'm sorry, that was the old. You can always write me at ken@kenzermanjr.com and drop me a question. I love to hear from people, and I love to talk about the questions and give the answers on the podcast. So please feel free to reach out. Next week, we will be talking about true crime incidents in professional wrestling, and I will talk about some of the better matches from AEW and WWE over the last few weeks. So until next Monday, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.